Good afternoon. I'm Veral Powell, a clinical teaching fellow at the University of Baltimore School of Law's Community Development Clinic. I also co-teach a law and organizing course. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which looks at how the government views and regulates civil disobedience and the roles that federalism and structural racism play in this power dynamic. Over the next hour, our three very knowledgeable panelists will share their understanding of these issues. I will be the moderator for this discussion. We look forward to your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about a recent addition to our webinar schedule in light of the sad news of the previous 2 weeks. On Thursday, October 15th, we'll be hosting a webinar titled Notorious RBG, The Life and Legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You can learn more and register on the UB Law website. And now for this afternoon's discussion, our esteemed panel features Professor Robert Knowles, who has been a faculty member at UB Law since 2018. He teaches national security law, administrative law, and civil procedure. He earned his JD at Northwestern University School of Law. Next, we have Professor Odina Neal, who has been teaching at UB since 1989. She teaches juvenile justice law, human rights law, and property law. She earned her GD at Harvard. Finally, we have Professor Matthew Lindsay, who teaches torts, American legal history, and legal analysis. He's been part of the UB faculty since 2009 and earned his JD at Yale. Thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our guests for tuning in as well. Before I begin some questions to our panelists, I thought I'd briefly contextualize our discussion this afternoon. We are amidst a long, hot summer that began with the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th. The unprecedented scale and level of the social movement that has erupted, which has brought out tens of millions of Americans amidst the pandemic, include a variety of tactics that has been generalized across the nation, from the civil disobedience of highway occupations to more disruptive and destructive forms that directly target police and government property. And though there have been ebbs and flows to this movement, with the regularity and systematized nature of police violence in the United States against Black lives, as we've seen with Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and Jacob Blake, and with the inadequacy of legal channels to deliver justice to victims of police violence, there is no end to this long, hot summer in sight. And as a social movement legal scholar myself, this moment is incredibly exciting because I believe that structural transformations only occur after seismic social upheaval on the streets. To invoke history, one could observe that but for the hundreds of thousands of Black Americans marching in Washington, D.C. in 1963, coupled with the preceding decade plus of strategic breaking of unjust laws to disrupt a segregated economy, there would be no Civil Rights Act of 1964. One can thus conclude that the actual or perceived disruption to power is key. Here with the George Floyd movement, we've seen that both the sustained demonstrations in major cities and the actual or threatened disruption to power has accomplished more in one summer than what progressive lawyers and policymakers have been trying to accomplish in decades with criminal justice reform efforts. This summer has transformed an entire generation on what effective advocacy looks like. To invoke an analogy used by Malcolm X in 1964, what was so difficult to accomplish by the ballot has been accomplished at a furious pace by the bullet. We're now seeing defund the police on the policy table. In fact, the former Prince George County executive and Baltimore police commissioner have both gone on record to say they support defunding the police. Of course, this points to the obvious. Defund has different meanings to different people, from abolishing police on one end of the spectrum to redistribution of tax dollars into programs such as violence prevention, education, and social services. But the broader point is, compared to just a few years ago, The demand was to reform the police, to install more diversity hiring and trainings, more technology, more infrastructure, meaning more money or more funding into police departments, as epitomized with the consent decree in the city. And it's not just talk or rhetoric that's changed. We're seeing immediate, tangible results directly flowing from the George Floyd movement. Within days, the Minneapolis City Council voted to dismantle their police department and replace it with a new holistic public health-oriented approach. Locally here in early June, Baltimore City Council agreed to $22 million in proposed cuts to the $500 million police budget. And still locally at Johns Hopkins University, the president there agreed to defer the creation of private police force by 2 years. Relevant to our discussion this afternoon, this scope and scale of the George Floyd movement has been met by escalating responses by the federal government to curb civil unrest in states and localities. This is manifested in a few specific ways. First, multiple reports have confirmed that various federal law enforcement agencies were authorized by the DOJ information with local and state law enforcement agencies. This has ranged from aerial surveillance to sophisticated cell phone cloning attacks to intercept protesters' phone communications in Portland. Second, the president increasingly amped up rhetoric about interfering in states to control civil unrest and to protect monuments and federal property, including citations to the 1807 Insurrection Act, culminating in an executive order and the deployment of federal law enforcement agents in Portland. Yet at the same time, there has been an inability or unwillingness of government, both at the federal and state levels, to control the presence of paramilitary or self-described private militia in protests, most notoriously in Kenosha recently. These disparate responses by the federal government implicate both federalism and structural racism. So before I jump into questions, just so we have a working definition of federalism, when we say that the United States is structured as a federalist government, we mean that the United States Constitution has established a system of dual sovereignty under which states have surrendered many of their powers to the federal government, but also retain some sovereignty. In general, the federal government only has the authority expressly given to it by the Constitution. It's enumerated powers. These powers are those necessarily to establish, unify, and defend the country, and specifically pertain to national defense, international trade, foreign policy, immigration, patents, and interstate commerce. The president is also understood to have certain inherent powers, mostly associated with foreign affairs and national defense. States are thus empowered within what is known as their police powers to address everything unenumerated, which entails a broad range of issues pertaining to their citizens, including their health and well-being. Since the founding era, American politicians and jurists have disagreed about the precise scope of congressional and presidential authority, and spirited debate continues to this day. But there remains a general consensus that although federal authority has expanded significantly since the 1930s, the individual states retain authority over a broad swath of local issues under their inherent police powers, including law enforcement. With that, I'm going to turn to our panelists. And the first question to Professor Lindsay, historically, what are the respective roles of the federal government and the states in policing in general and responding to civil unrest in particular? You're muted right now.
It was bound to happen. I just didn't think it would be so quickly. Apologies for that. So important question, and I think the answer follows pretty directly from your definition of federalism that you just gave. It's really important to understand that the default source of most law enforcement in the United States is state and local. And as you said, under their traditional police powers, states have broad power to regulate the public welfare, and that's understood as a particularly broad term. And then the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution, which reserves the power to the states and to the people, that's not, as you said, expressly delegated to the federal government, also affirms this. So most criminal law is state law, and that includes law governing violence, drug trafficking, theft, most of the categories of crime that you would think about. Now, as you suggested, over the course of the nation's history, the federal role in criminal law has expanded significantly, just like the federal role in a lot of areas: healthcare, education, economic regulation, labor relations, environmental law. All of these areas has dramatically expanded as well. But despite this trend, the state police powers today remain very broad. And especially for most contemporary conservatives, the federal encroachment onto state authority should be narrow and it should be exceptional. So I think we can say that historically, the federal government has definitely been the junior partner in law enforcement. The FBI and other federal agencies are routinely involved in the enforcement of federal law and in the protection of federal property and constitutional rights. But the federal government does not enforce state law, and federal involvement in responding to civil unrest has been relatively rare. So that's basically the backdrop. A limited role for domestic policing and in suppressing civil unrest, and one that's typically, to the extent that the federal agents do come in and involve themselves, as we've seen in Portland recently, it's been done in collaboration with, at the invitation of state and local officials.
Great, thanks. And Professor Knowles, building off that point, here in the recent days, the president didn't exactly get the invitation by state governors or localities to send in or deploy federal law enforcement. Instead, the president cited the Insurrection Act, among other authorities, to justify the deployment of federal law enforcement to cities like Portland and Chicago. Is that correct? And what other legal bases exist for federal police intervention domestically to quell unrest?
Sure. Well, that sort of brings us to the National Guard, which can serve a dual function. So the National Guard is ordinarily under the control of the states, the state governments. So the governors are the heads of their respective state National Guards. But the National Guard can be federalized under certain circumstances during emergencies and under a statute called the Insurrection Act. But the norm is that the National Guards are used, to support law enforcement in the states, to respond to emergencies, to be there in the event that the ordinary police are not able to handle a particular problem. But this also gets us to the difference between what is the function of policing and what is the function of the military. And traditionally, they've been quite different. Obviously, there's some degree of overlap between the two, but the job of police fundamentally is to maintain order, right, and to enforce laws. And the perspective of a police department in any jurisdiction is that unless evidence emerges that someone is violating the law, then there's a presumption of innocence. Like there's a presumption that everyone in that jurisdiction is basically harmless, right? The military operates under a different presumption. In fact, the opposite. The military its function is to fight wars. And when you fight a war, you have an enemy. And so the military operates when it is, in that war mode. It first identifies who the enemy is, and then it uses its resources to pursue the enemy. So what happens when the military is used for law enforcement purposes is that you get this confusion about roles, and that's what we're seeing, and that's what we've seen through the president's use of the military, but also its use of federal agents. And one more quick thing, which I think is really important in this context, is the militarization of policing. So especially in urban areas where, and this is where the structural racism comes into it, we see this shift in attitudes, or maybe a continuation of this attitude about policing, which is similar to a military attitude, in that policing certain areas especially urban areas, is just like operating in a war zone. And you flip the traditional policing presumption on its head. You're treating the population that you are policing as enemies or potential enemies, right? And this is something that's been recurring in recent American history. Professor Lindsay is a historian, I'm not. But it was during the mid-1960s riots in American cities, where at the same time the Vietnam War was going on, what began to happen is that those who were fighting the counterinsurgency in Vietnam began to come back to the United States, to come back home, and started training police officers in counterinsurgency techniques. And police officers started to develop SWAT teams. And Daryl Gates, or the famous or infamous police chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, is sort of the innovator of a lot of these. He innovated the SWAT team, which he originally wanted to call Special Weapons Attack Teams. And he was overridden by his superior, who said, "No, we're police. We don't create units to attack. That's what the military does. We create units, right, to police." But nonetheless, Daryl Gates became chief, and his sort of philosophy took over, and you saw the militarization of the police, and this sort of fusion of what the conception of policing and the military is. So you saw now we have the military doing a lot of what used to be policing, and we have the police operating in many respects like a military. And I think I probably talked for too long, so I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Well, that's an interesting point that you're making, though, which again implicates structural racism. This flipping a presumption I'm hearing from a presumption of innocent, a traditional law enforcement presumption, to a militaristic, presumption that especially communities of color are just like foreign enemies, and there's a presumption of enemy in policing and SWAT teams in communities of color. So to bring it back to this current moment, I want to turn back to Professor Lindsay. We've seen the president and attorney general repeatedly cite the protection of federal property as the overriding justification for the deployment of federal agencies. Yet many reports have confirmed that once on the ground, federal officers extended this mandate by targeting and arresting protesters miles away from federal property. Would it be accurate to say that the defense of federal property is pretextual? You're muted again.
I'm so used to being the professor that never has to mute himself. This is a new adjustment for me. So there's no question that federal officers can be deployed to enforce federal law and to protect federal property, like post offices and courthouses and monuments and things of that sort. And there's no dispute that in Portland, for example, some minority of the protesters, and it may even have been in the hundreds, did in fact commit federal crimes when they vandalized the federal courthouse and then overnight lit it on fire. But I think that this conversation about the legitimacy of the federal presence in Portland lacked the nuance that it deserves. The fact that federal property was genuinely threatened there doesn't give those federal agents blanket license to police the streets of Portland. And in fact, as you just said, their operations extended far, far beyond the protection of federal property. They rounded up protesters miles from that federal courthouse that they were ostensibly there to protect. And when we consider that those agents were also there against the declared wishes of state and local officials, and we consider that in combination with the political purpose to which those violent clashes were immediately put in the form of campaign ads, I think it's really hard to escape the conclusion that these operations were as much about suppressing this massive and growing movement for racial justice, as well as creating clashes with protesters that the president believes are politically useful for him. Now, the president's threats then to deploy federal agents to other US cities, including Chicago, not to protect federal property, but rather to fight violent crime, I think really underscores the political theater aspect of all of this. So does the more recent designation of certain cities, New York, Seattle, Portland, as anarchist jurisdictions. Okay? And all of this, I think, has created a really jarring paradox around federalism. You know, the principle of local control over policing and other issues has been a true cornerstone of both political and legal conservatism for more than 100 years. And yet you have a conservative president, a very conservative attorney general and DHS secretary deploying border patrol agents dressed in battle gear, carrying military grade weapons to American cities and apprehending protesters in unmarked vans miles from any kind of federal property. I mean, this is not James Madison's federalism, okay? And that's why just the virtual silence of conservatism in Congress is so striking. I mean, this just seems like it should be a very easy opportunity to stand on principle. And yet, you know, with the exception of Rand Paul and Mitt Romney, and I may have missed one or two others, the response has pretty much been silence and the averting of eyes.
Thank you, Professor Lindsay, for adding another dimension, the political nature or the political deployment of federalism and sort of the paradox as you're naming. Let's turn now to Professor Neal, who is I know you specialize in juvenile justice law, and I want to ask you, just like in 2014, in the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown, when we saw a lot of youth participate and lead the Black Lives Matter movement, youth have been out in the streets here in Baltimore and nationwide during the George Floyd uprising. Is the participation of youth in demonstrations a recent phenomenon, or has it been a persistent theme in racial justice movements throughout the nation's history? Professor Neal, you are muted.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Children have always participated in the quest for racial justice. It's important to remember, for example, that Frederick Douglass, when he escaped slavery, was only 20 years old. And he wrote in his autobiography that he made the decision to escape when he was 16, when he had received a beating and he said it was too much. And we all know that during the time of school desegregation, of course, it was children that were on the front lines of the school desegregation movement, often being protected by federal guards as they went into their classrooms, even as there might be throngs of very angry white people surrounding those federal agents. The children, in other words, knew that despite whatever was going on in their localities, that the federal government was there to protect them. And not only the children that were actually participating in the school desegregation movements, but also people that were watching them, children that were watching other children and seeing what kind of protection they could expect. In addition to the desegregation movements, however, in the broader civil rights movements, children have always played a role. There was a march that specifically utilized children in 1963 in Alabama called the Children's Crusade. And children were used well, I shouldn't say used, children were participated in that. But the thinking of the organizers was first, children didn't have to worry about losing their jobs if they participated in a march, so they were good for that. Children respond very much to peer pressure, so if all of your friends were going down to protest, you probably go too. And because the children, as we all know, children tend not to have a fear of consequences in the way that adults do. And indeed, there has been Supreme Court law that has been made because of children protesting, so that the decision by the Supreme Court of the US not to require jury trials in juvenile cases was based on the case of 45 children in North Carolina, all of whom were processed through the juvenile justice system simply because of their participation in the in a protest. So children participating in these movements is not new. But I do think it's important to think about, and when my colleagues were speaking before, I'd never thought about this before, but it is important to remember that there are children watching all of this. They are participating, yes, but they are also watching. And in the 60s, perhaps because there were some things the federal government was doing that we didn't know about, like COINTELPRO and all of that. But what the visual gave was that when states or municipalities were behaving in an illegal way or an unfair way, that the federal government would serve as a shield. They would protect those people who were out of power, and that the federal government, not just in terms of the executive and legislative branch, but also the judicial branch, was there to serve as a backstop to pure majority rule. In other words, those institutions were there to protect minorities, however you define minority. So in answer to your question, is this new? Is children's participation in this new? No, it is not. In fact, some would argue that children have always played a crucial role in the attempt to achieve full civil rights for all people of color and Black people in particular.
Great. And continuing with you, Professor Neal, to build off something you said in terms of what children are taking away from the federal response being so heavy-handed right now. So with federal law enforcement being so conspicuous in sending in, other federal agencies into localities to contain civil unrest, what lessons are you taking away today about the federal government itself, both how the federal government actually works in practice and what the federal government maybe ought to be doing for children instead?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I think that it is important, and I'm going to rely on a little bit of brain science now and social science, but it is important to remember that in terms of political knowledge, children learn their politics from the media. They learn about it more than they do from their friends or their families or their teachers. Now, part of that is because the average high school student watches or consumes about 48 hours of media a week. And so they're watching it all the time. And adolescence is also a time when children's brains are primed for learning. In other words, as a matter of not only psychology, but also biology, children's brains are being shaped by what it is that they view. So what is it that they're learning now? Well, first of all, they're learning that democracy means majority rule, and it doesn't mean anything else. I think that it's significant that not only in the United States, but also around the world, that that children are coming to believe that perhaps democracy is not a viable form of government, because they understand that democracy simply means the exercise of raw power. And that, of course, is what they are seeing. Anytime you watch protesters, peaceful protesters by and large, that are being confronted by federal government authorities, or for that matter, state authorities, what they're coming to learn is that it is the role of the government to be strong through the use of force. In other words, they aren't seeing anything that suggests that the federal government should work to try to build consensus. They aren't seeing anything that suggests the federal government sees its role as the protection of minorities. They don't see anything that suggests that legislation to protect them is something that should happen, because it's not happening. So my fear, frankly, is that not only for the immediate future, but because of the way that these images imprint themselves on children's brains, that it's going to have long-lasting effects. And by the way, don't think that the people in power don't know this. I mean, President Trump comes from a TV background, and he understands, if nothing else, he understands how television works. So he understands how these images are not only shaping public policy now, but could be shaping the way that now children and future adults are going to be affected by these images. And quite honestly, I am very concerned about that, not only for the children's biological well-being, which we can get into those weeds later, but I'm also afraid about what it may mean in terms of the difficulty in changing political discourse for these children.
Let me throw out maybe to all three of you, but on the theme of what lessons are being learned by the youth and the general polity or civil society, you know, especially in light of the politicization of federal courts, of these seemingly neutral institutions that we put a lot of faith in. I mean, earlier I proposed in the introduction that one of the lessons being learned is a new way to do advocacy, right? That social movements themselves are accomplishing a lot faster what was trying to be done by criminal justice advocates, lawyers, policymakers for years now. So is there that counter lesson also about people power, about new channels where democracy is not defined through perhaps a vote or through, you know, the traditional channels, but through movement on the streets?
I mean, I'll just say something really quick, which I think actually is more of a historian's view. But I mean, one thing that the success of the civil rights movement, and also, you know, similarly Gandhi in India, is that, excuse me one second. Sorry about that. I have children in my house. That part of the strategy is to provoke, through peaceful means, a disproportionately aggressive response from the authorities. And so it is part of that what we're seeing now with the very aggressive military style response, is that in some ways these peaceful demonstrations are doing the work that they actually are intended to do, which is to create this, you know, what Trump likes to do, which is performative, you know, aggressiveness. And a lot of what he's done is actually, you know, just to relate it back to Professor Neal's point, is about sending a message. It isn't even necessarily about actually doing something in these places. Like, it's not really, making a serious difference in terms of the policing problems that may be occurring. Instead, it's to say, look what I can do with my federal power. And he used the District of Columbia, which is not a state, and so where these federalism principles are not implicated, to bring the resources of the federal government to bear, and to use all of them to in a very this display of military force, which included flyovers, and actually using the military chain of command in order to disrupt, and respond to the protesters.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll jump in terms of, lessons learned. I think, Beryl, you're absolutely right that this is a kind of inspiring moment that is showing people the power of mass mobilization. I think on the other side of the picture, though, is a point that Professor Neal made. To build on that, this is not a moment, unlike the civil rights era, where young people who are mobilized in the street and who are watching this on television can say to themselves, the federal government is on our side. One of the most iconic images of the civil rights era, it's one that I show in my legal history and constitutional law classes, is the National Guard deployed to Central High School in Little Rock by a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, in 1957. And the National Guard is arranged around a tank, right? The ultimate symbol of military force. And the National Guard is there in the interest of enforcing the Supreme Court's mandate in Brown versus Board of Education. It's there for justice. It's there to play an important role in disestablishing the nation's racial caste system. And when I think about the contrast between that image, which was viewed by millions of people the world over, and a generation of budding activists, when I think about the contrast between that and the image of Border Patrol agents clashing in the streets with young protesters today, I think it could not be more striking.
Let me also be a little bit perhaps more cynical than you are, Bill, with respect to the consequences of the protests that are going on right now. I think that they are important. I hope that people are able to maintain the energy and the focus that is necessary in order for the protests to result in systemic change. But at the same time, when I think about the what you saw as occurring because of the protests, at least so far, it feels to me only like rhetoric. I mean, people have said that they're going to defund the police, but we don't know what that means from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out if in the not too distant future, we begin to see jurisdictions pulling back from that. And in fact, it's important to remember that we have two presidential candidates right now, neither of whom is interested in responding at all to the idea of defunding the police. And I don't know about President Trump, but Vice President Biden has indicated that he wants to give police more money. So I'm not so sure that, we should protest because it results in change is a message that really comes through, at least not yet. At the same time, though, I acknowledge that I'm old, and so I'm cynical. And this is why I do believe in young people participating in these kinds of protests, because it is only young people who believe that they can change the world. And in fact, they are the only people who can.
Thank you to all three panelists for discussing some of these lessons that our youth are taking away. I want to ask kind of a follow-up. One of the themes that came out was, this discrepancy of the federal government being on the side of civil rights and protection of minority rights in the past, and the discrepancy to today where federal government is doing exactly the opposite. So that begs the question, earlier, Professor Lindsay, you mentioned that there's quite a gap between the Madisonian vision of federalism and what is being applied right now by conservatives. And so is it a political strategy to invoke this sort of originalist federalism and use it to throw at the president and the federal government to curb their aggression?
Almost did it again. Is it a political strategy? I don't know that the president necessarily thinks in terms of federalism as a political strategy. I mean, I think a lot of people are opportunistic federalists, and they love it when it serves their political ends, and they're skeptical of it when it doesn't. But I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I don't quite understand what you're getting at.
I am getting at the paradox of federalism. The rhetoric of, even among conservatives, is that federalism should actually, curb the power of federal law enforcement from entering local jurisdictions, right? And is it, I guess, an interest convergence? Is it a strategy that liberals can take on, for example, to, say, hey, what the vision of the traditional conservative line is actually being violated by the practice of the president, deploying these troops. So is it a strategy? Is it a maneuver that liberals can use?
I think that people who are critical of the president's response to the protests can and should point to hypocrisy when they see it. And I think this is an opportunity to do that. Contemporary conservatives champion federalism. They champion the sovereignty of states and localities in policing and across a broad range of other areas. And they champion it not as a matter of opposing civil rights. That hasn't been true for 50 years, but rather as a principled constitutional defense that, truth be said, has plenty of support in founding era commentary over the proper structure of government. And I do think that's exactly why the president's recent dramatic use of federal authority to override the wishes of state and local officials is so striking. And I think it should be called out for the hypocrisy that it is. And although I never really suspected that President Trump was a principled federalist or that he thought much about it at all, I do think it's remarkable how many people around him have been complicit, right? From the Attorney General to his congressional allies. And so I think there is value in reminding conservatives what they believe. And I think many of them do sincerely believe in a Madisonian style federalism. And I think that at least in my lifetime, I've never seen such a striking betrayal of that vision by a Republican or by a Democrat.
I guess I would add to that, that I mean, the cynical side of me will also wants to say, in addition to that, I think that's an excellent observation, that in terms of crime, at least in recent decades, the federal government has increased its power and intervened locally on one side. I mean, it's what we're seeing now is really the culmination of decades and decades of trends, towards militarization of police departments, towards the federal government providing military equipment and supplies and helping create a culture in local police departments that resembles the military. And so that's kind of the dark side of, of what we saw in Little Rock back in the 60s. We're seeing the flip side of it now. But I think one of the questions was, what do you see as the future of federalism? And I think it's, you know, especially with the Supreme Court now probably having, you know, a 6-2 conservative majority, we're going to see that states will need to, as rights are rolled back, we're going to see that states will need to once again be the places where rights are reconstituted, you know, rethought, and you know, these includes things, you know, well beyond the scope of this discussion, but states are going to have to play a more important role, because the court is not playing, the Supreme Court of the United States I'm talking about, of course, is not going to be playing the same role, at least in supporting the rights that we've come to expect it to, at least, you know, on recent times. Instead, the Supreme Court is going to be much more interested in protecting free speech rights of businesses. It's going to be much more interested in protecting free exercise of religion and Second Amendment, right? And it's going to be much less interested in the criminal defendants' rights and so forth, to kind of bring it back to this topic.
You know, I can't really say that any of us really knows what the future of federalism is, because if you had asked that question 10 years ago, I don't think any of us would answer that question the way that we would now. But I do think that it's important to understand that although we are in some ways talking about federalism, in other ways we really are not. We are talking about the capture of government, and some state governments, but definitely the federal government, of I would say a group of people that don't truly believe in democracy. All right, that to me is the problem. It isn't federalism versus states, or federal government versus state government. It's really, do you honestly believe in democracy? And I also think that one of the things that makes me nervous about the business of saying, well, let's look to the states, is that, you know, it strikes me that although it may have been true or a good thing at some point in our country's history, this idea of states' rights and states making decisions for its citizens that may be different for the citizens of other states is worrisome, because we don't live in a world now where, quite honestly, the state that you reside in should make that much of a difference to what rights you either have or don't have as a citizen of this country. Is it okay, for instance, if a state decided, well, we're not going to publicly educate our children anymore? Would we say that the federal government shouldn't get involved because it's a states' rights thing? We've seen it with the Affordable Care Act, where some states have decided to opt out, leaving their citizens vulnerable to not having health insurance at all. Should we really leave that up to the states to decide whether or not their citizens have health care? Or even, there's any number of things that we usually think, oh, well, the state deals with that, or the city deals with that, or the county deals with that. But it seems to me that in the year 2020, with respect to the provision of baseline services and the like, where you live should not make a difference. Whether you live in Arizona or Texas or Utah or Maine, it shouldn't make any difference. And so for me, all of the problems with the federal government that are in the world right now really don't speak to federalism. To me, they represent a collapse of democracy, and that is a very different matter.
Great. In the 10 minutes or so that we have, I want to give each panelists an opportunity to say some final words. I know that there has been certain conversation already in the chat. This is great. And I know that a few professors have been engaging with a certain idea. Well, why don't we address this idea just so I know that this particular individual has, made a few points in chat. But the question is, why is it not okay for the federal government to enter into localities that seem to be taken over by certain populations of people in these localities, which the president recently called anarchist jurisdictions? Why is it not okay for the federal government? Or maybe that framing's too crude, but what are issues? And I know Professor Neal and Professor Knowles, you've already begun answering this, but if I just wanted to throw it out there maybe for a couple minutes before you have some closing comments.
I mean, I guess I would add that that's because that's what the framers of our Constitution intended. Like, they were very extremely wary of standing armies because of their experience under British rule. And they intended for the states to exercise the lion's share, the vast majority of policing power, and for them to have the federal government come in and, and retake control because the local authorities had ceded control of a couple of blocks in a city. I think would have still at that time would have been considered to be absurd. The federal government was all about protecting the mails, and interstate commerce. It wasn't about solving local policing problems. And for me, it goes back to what's the function of the police and what is the function of the military. And there are federal law enforcement entities, of course, but they have very specialized functions like Customs and Border Protection and the Secret Service and so forth. And they should not be, freelancing. There should not be a free-floating federal police force that the president can dispatch in order to intervene in local situations, especially when the local government has said stay out.
Great. So why don't we transition to final remarks? Professor Lindsay, if there was one or two takeaways from this topic, what would they be?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is so striking about this for me has been the political rhetoric surrounding the president's characterization of the protests. Anarchists, right? This is a word that sounds like it's been broken out of a time capsule from some bygone era of political demagoguery. And yet we've heard more about anarchists in the last 6 months than I think we have in the last 60 years. And there's a certain kind of tendency that is part of that label to name a boogeyman, right? A boogeyman of the month. The president likes to have a boogeyman. He had one during the 2018 election cycle when it was the caravan about to violate the southern border from Central America. It feels like a decade or so now ago that happened, but that was relatively recent. And increasingly in thinking about the rhetoric surrounding the kind of un-American anarchists taking over American cities, I've increasingly, I think, appreciated that this is more than just political theater. That there's a kind of dangerous legal component to this as well, because the boogeyman is always somehow beyond the pale of American law. And it's beyond the pale of American law in a way that requires a kind of almost unprecedented assertion of federal authority without regard to normal legal and constitutional limits. Right, with the caravan, it was the barbarians at the gates. With the un-American anarchists, it's the barbarians in our streets. And in neither case, the suggestion is, should quaint notions about legal and constitutional guardrails prevent the president from protecting the nation. And to bring it back to today's topic, there is a really striking racial element to this language as well. And I don't just mean that the object of the protests is racial justice. The president has a long history, as we all know, of using ideas of racial otherness as a brand of illegitimacy, right? And especially when those racial others are threatening to unsettle the nation's racial caste system, right? As we all saw, he first gained political relevance questioning Barack Obama's citizenship, right? He led the assault on mostly African-American athletes kneeling during the national anthem. He brazenly told 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from, and the list goes on and on and on. And so there are no shortage of examples of the president casting African-Americans who make political noise as un-American. And I think the racial otherness of the anarchist boogeyman today helps for him to kind of underscore the un-Americanness of the protests and their demands.
Thanks. Professor Neal.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when I think about what the future could look like, I think about Kyle Rittenhouse. And you may remember that Kyle Rittenhouse is a teenager in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who, after sort of coming together with a group of like-minded, I guess, kids and adults, ended up shooting 3 people, and 2 of them died. I think those are the facts. What concerns me about this moment is that I'm afraid that there will be other children who will be affected the same way. And some of that, again, is basic psychology. But again, as a juvenile justice teacher, I understand that there are brain changes that happen to children when they are under stress and when they are exposed to toxic environments. And the way that it affects children's brains is that they are always vigilant for threat and danger. They're always on point for that. And as they get older, they are less able to control their mood. They can't control their impulses. They can't engage in thoughtful decision making. They can't engage in planning. So I do believe that we need to be concerned about this moment and what it might mean for children along all kinds of racial spectrums, that to take away their being able to be full and healthy adults because of this moment in history. And of course, the enforcement of these things is race. I think it's going to be hard to deny anything about that, but I will let, having said my say for children, because I'm always wanting to speak for the kids, I'll let my colleague Rob end us out.
That's really hard to follow. I think when I think about our discussion tonight, I think of the past. We've referenced in the past, and then in the figure of someone like Kyle Rittenhouse, the future. And what President Trump does, and who knows, I mean, is he likes to play the greatest hits of our demagogues of past. The anarchists, the socialists, and the others, and creating this other. And so for me, it all connects into the use of the military, like sort of as this default impulse for someone who wants to otherize a community comes naturally. So we see that the president is interested in using the military for all sorts of things, like for distributing a potential vaccine, and it's this, the things to me are sort of intertwined. Like what are we teaching our children about how the military should be used? When someone like Kyle Rittenhouse gets valorized by the Republican Party, and so that I would leave it where Professor Neal left it, which is let's think about this effect on the children.
Well, great. It is 6 o'clock on the dot. So it's a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists this afternoon. Thank you to all our guests here who attended this webinar. And please look at the UB Law website to register for the upcoming panel on the notorious RBG, Life and Legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Thank you for your time, and we'll end here.